The speech lasted 4 hours. No cameras, no foreign press. The doors of the 20th Party Congress were sealed from the outside by KGB personnel, who had been given instructions they did not fully understand, which was itself a signal to anyone paying attention that what was happening inside the room was something the people running it had not fully decided how to classify. Nikita Khrushchev stood at the podium and dismantled Joseph Stalin. He named the purges. He named the torture. He named the men who had been executed on fabricated evidence, the marshals shot on the eve of the war that almost destroyed the country, the millions consumed by a system of terror that had been presented to the Soviet people and the world as the necessary instrument of historical progress. He spoke for 4 hours, and when he finished, several delegates had fainted. Others wept. One man, it was later reported, suffered a fatal heart attack in his seat. The speech was supposed to be secret. Within weeks, a copy had reached the CIA through Israeli intelligence. Within months, it had been broadcast on Radio Free Europe to audiences across the Eastern Bloc. Within a year, it had restructured the ideological landscape of international communism in ways that Khrushchev had not fully calculated and could not fully control. What Khrushchev had not calculated, specifically, was Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov heard the speech from the audience. He sat in his uniform, covered in the medals of a man who had broken the Wehrmacht at 3 of the most decisive battles in human history, and he listened to Khrushchev describe a Soviet leadership that had gutted the officer corps on the eve of those battles, that had arrested 35,000 military officers, that had shot 3 of the 5 top marshals, that had made the Red Army fight the most devastating war in European history with its institutional spine severed by the NKVD. Zhukov knew all of this. He had lived it. He had commanded men who survived it, and men who didn't, and he had spent the post-war years in enforced political obscurity, because Stalin had understood, correctly, that a man with Zhukov's popularity inside the military was a political force that could not be permitted to accumulate freely. He sat in that room listening to Khrushchev describe the crimes of the system and felt, for the first time in years, that the air had changed, that something which had been fixed and permanent and suffocating had moved, slightly, in a direction he had not expected. Zhukov was the most popular man in the Soviet Union, not the most powerful. That distinction belonged to the politicians in the Kremlin. But popularity and power are different currencies, and in the specific conditions of 1956, Zhukov held a reserve of the first that no one in the room had fully accounted for. Khrushchev had accounted for it more than anyone. He had used it deliberately, specifically, and with complete strategic clarity. When he needed to arrest Beria in June 1953, Zhukov and his armed generals had walked through the presidium doors and done what no politician in the room could have done alone. The military had been the instrument. Zhukov had been the instrument's edge. Khrushchev understood what he had used. He also understood, with the cold precision of a man who had survived Stalin's court by reading people with total accuracy, what that instrument could become if it was ever turned around. He began watching Zhukov the way Stalin had watched everyone. To understand why Khrushchev eventually destroyed the one man who had made his own survival possible, the man whose loyalty had been real, whose service had been genuine, whose contribution to the post-Stalin Soviet Union was arguably larger than any other single individual, you have to understand what Khrushchev feared more than failure. He feared replacement. Not death, not political defeat in the abstract. Replacement by a specific kind of man, a man with genuine independent authority, genuine popular legitimacy, genuine institutional loyalty from an organization that operated outside party control. A man who did not need Khrushchev's permission to be significant. Zhukov was exactly that man, and in 1957 he made the error of demonstrating it in a context that Khrushchev could not ignore. The crisis came first. In June 1957, a coalition of Presidium members, Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich, and others, made a coordinated attempt to remove Khrushchev from the first secretaryship. The vote in the Presidium went against him, 7-4. Khrushchev refused to accept the result, arguing that only the full Central Committee had the authority to remove the first secretary. It was a procedural argument of dubious constitutional standing, but it bought him time. The problem was getting the Central Committee members to Moscow fast enough to matter. The plotters controlled the Presidium. If they could formalize their decision before Khrushchev assembled a countervailing majority, the procedural argument became irrelevant. Zhukov solved the problem with military aircraft. He ordered Soviet military transport planes to collect Central Committee members from across the country and fly them to Moscow within hours. It was an act of institutional overreach so enormous that it should have generated its own political crisis. The defense minister using military assets to resolve an internal party dispute was precisely the kind of military involvement in politics that the Soviet system was structured to prevent. Nobody said anything about it. They were too busy watching Khrushchev survive. The Central Committee assembled. Khrushchev won. Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich were expelled from the Presidium, denounced as the anti-party group, and dispatched to obscure administrative postings. Malenkov to a hydroelectric plant in Kazakhstan, Molotov to Mongolia as ambassador, Kaganovich to a potash factory in the Urals. In the aftermath, Zhukov was rewarded. He was elevated to full membership in the Presidium, the first professional military officer in Soviet history to hold that position. It was the peak of his political power. It was also, though he did not know it at the time, the moment Khrushchev decided he had to go. Because what the June crisis had demonstrated, with a clarity that Khrushchev found deeply uncomfortable, was that Zhukov's loyalty was real but Zhukov's power was independent. The military aircraft had saved Khrushchev, but the military aircraft had been Zhukov's decision. It had not required Khrushchev's authorization. It had not run through party channels. It had been one man making a unilateral decision to deploy military assets in a domestic political crisis because he judged the outcome desirable. What Zhukov had done for Khrushchev in 1957, Zhukov could do against Khrushchev in 1958, or 1959, or whenever Zhukov decided the outcome was no longer desirable. Khrushchev could not control that variable, and a variable he could not control, sitting inside an institution, the military, that operated with a degree of genuine independence from party oversight, was not an asset he could afford to maintain indefinitely. He needed a pretext. Zhukov, being Zhukov, eventually provided one. Throughout 1957, Zhukov had been systematically reducing the role of party political officers, the Zampoliti, inside military units. These officers were the party's eyes and ears inside the armed forces, responsible for monitoring ideological conformity, reporting suspicious conversations, and ensuring that military loyalty ran through the party, rather than purely through the military chain of command. Their presence was, from a purely military efficiency standpoint, a genuine obstacle. They consumed resources, complicated command structures, and represented an organizational principle fundamentally at odds with military effectiveness. Zhukov reduced their authority. He restricted their access to operational planning. He argued, in internal military forums, that the professional competence of the officer corps was the appropriate foundation for military loyalty, not the surveillance of political officers who frequently knew nothing about the operations they were supposedly monitoring. This was militarily rational. It was politically catastrophic, because what Zhukov was describing, a military whose loyalty ran through professional chains of command rather than through party political structures, was precisely the thing that every Soviet leader since Lenin had understood to be the existential threat to party supremacy. An army that answered to its generals first, and the party second, was not a Soviet army. It was a potential coup instrument. Khrushchev received reports about Zhukov's reforms of the political officer structure with the specific attention of a man who has been waiting for a pretext and has just been handed one that fits. In October 1957, Zhukov flew to Yugoslavia for an official visit. While he was in the air, Khrushchev convened a meeting of the Presidium. By the time Zhukov's plane landed in Belgrade, his removal had been decided. By the time he flew back to Moscow, the Central Committee plenum that would formalize his dismissal had been scheduled. The charges were assembled with bureaucratic efficiency. Zhukov had promoted a cult of personality around himself. There were documentaries about his wartime command, books celebrating his military genius, a visibility in Soviet public culture that the Presidium now characterized as inappropriate self-promotion. He had attempted to place the military outside party control. He had shown Bonapartist tendencies, a term that, in Soviet political vocabulary, carried a specific meaning, a military commander who considered his own authority to transcend the civilian political structures above him. The Bonapartism charge was the sharpest. It named, with ideological precision, exactly what Khrushchev actually feared. Not that Zhukov had done anything, that Zhukov could do something, that the structure of his authority, real, independent, rooted in genuine institutional loyalty, rather than political appointment, made the possibility permanently available. The plenum convened on October 28, 1957. Zhukov was not warned. He walked into the room expecting a routine meeting and found himself the subject of it. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce him. Men who had served under him, men who owed their careers to his patronage, men who had shaken his hand and expressed gratitude for his leadership in forums that now, somehow, could not be remembered accurately enough to serve as references. They read from prepared statements. They described his arrogance, his insubordination, his dangerous accumulation of personal authority. Zhukov sat and listened with the expression of a man encountering, for the first time in his adult life, a form of combat he had no training for. He had fought the Wehrmacht. He had fought logistics crises and supply failures, and the specific chaos of industrial-scale warfare in conditions of extreme deprivation. He had fought Stalin's interference in military operations and Khrushchev's political demands, and the institutional resistance of a military bureaucracy resistant to modernization. He had never fought a room full of men reading prepared statements about his character. He had no weapons for this. He had spent his entire career in an environment where performance produced outcomes. The outcome in that room had been decided before he arrived. He was removed as defense minister. He was removed from the presidium. He was retired from the military with his rank and his medals intact. Khrushchev was not Stalin, and the lesson of 1953 had been absorbed thoroughly enough that physical elimination was no longer the default response to political defeat. But the retirement was designed to be total. Zhukov was given a dacha outside Moscow and removed from every forum in which his presence might constitute a competing center of gravity. He was not permitted to give interviews. He was not consulted on military affairs. He was not invited to the ceremonies that commemorated the battles he had commanded. His name appeared in official histories in reduced form, stripped of the narrative centrality that the actual record of those campaigns would have demanded. He spent the next decade writing his memoirs in a dacha, arguing with censors about what he was permitted to remember accurately, watching the Soviet military apparatus make decisions he considered catastrophically wrong without being able to say so in any forum that mattered. The memoir was eventually published, in a version so heavily edited by the censors that Zhukov described it as a document he barely recognized. He died in 1974. The full version of his memoir appeared posthumously, after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. The philosophical weight of what Khrushchev did to Zhukov is not primarily about ingratitude, though the ingratitude was real and enormous. It is about the specific logic of political survival in a system where power has no constitutional foundation. Khrushchev needed Zhukov in 1953 because Zhukov's military authority was the only force capable of neutralizing Beria's secret police. He needed him in 1957 because Zhukov's military logistics were the only mechanism capable of assembling the Central Committee fast enough to defeat the anti-party group. In both cases, the military instrument worked because it was genuinely independent. Because Zhukov's authority did not derive from Khrushchev, and therefore could be deployed in Khrushchev's defense, without requiring the kind of political authorization that the crisis had made impossible to obtain. But the independence that made Zhukov useful in a crisis was the same independence that made him dangerous in stability. You cannot have a genuinely independent military authority inside a system built on the principle that all authority flows from the party. The two things are structurally incompatible. One of them has to give. Khrushchev chose which one. He destroyed the man who had saved him because saving him had demonstrated, conclusively, that the man had the power to do it. And in a system where demonstrated power exists outside your control, the demonstration is itself the threat. Zhukov never understood this. He was a soldier. He thought loyalty was reciprocal. He thought service produced protection. He thought the man he had saved understood what saving cost. Khrushchev understood perfectly. That was precisely why Zhukov had to go. The man who could have replaced Khrushchev was not destroyed because he wanted the position. He was destroyed because he could have taken it. In the Soviet system, capability was indistinguishable from intent. And intent, once identified, had only one available response. If this is the kind of history that keeps you coming back, subscribe. It's free, it's instant, and it's the only way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment below. Do you think Zhukov ever understood why Khrushchev turned on him? I read every single one.